Hello, my name is Cynthia Smith, and I teach history at Honolulu Community College. I'm a professor of history at HCC. I've been there for almost 30 years. I've also been involved with History Day for about 30 years, either as a judge or a judge coordinator. So based on all those years of experience, and particularly involved with History Day, I wanted to talk to you today about addressing the significance in history as you're doing a History Day topic. So let's begin by defining what we mean by the significance in history, or talking about significance in your topic and your History Day project. First of all, it means going beyond just telling the story. Certainly telling the story is important, telling a good story, telling an accurate story. It's what we love about history is the storytelling aspect of it. But historical analysis in the historical field goes beyond just saying this happened, this happened, this happened, going beyond just giving a narration of events. It's giving meaning to those events. And that's what your analysis is, and that's what this issue of significance is. It's talking about not just what happened, and this person on this date, but why it happened. And that's significant to learn from and understand why things happen. And equally, if not even more important, understanding what happened as a result, what occurred as a result, what consequences or effects took place. So it's basically, as I say in my classroom, history is not just telling, when, who, why, and what and where. It's telling why and so what, right? What caused it and what consequences followed from that. And that's what you have to address to talk about significance. You are addressing, when you're looking at significance in history, you're addressing the whys and the so whats, the causes and effects. You're drawing conclusions from your research as to why things took place, as to the effects of events or changes in thinking or new technologies, why it took place and the effects. You're drawing conclusions about the impact of those changes. And then you, as the historian, identifying and arguing the meaning, the importance of those consequences, the meaning and the importance of what we learn from those causes. That's what doing significance in history is about. It's analyzing, it's drawing meaning, it's drawing conclusions from your research. It's going beyond just telling the story. So let me address why it's important to address significance in history. First and most important reason is that's what history is about. History is not about memorizing dates. It's not putting names on a timeline. It's making meaning of those historical stories. As I said, understanding causes and deriving lessons from understanding what led to changes in history. And it's understanding the effects and how those effects affected people then, later, and all the way to the present day. Understanding the roots of the world we live in, learning lessons from those events. So significance in history is really what historical analysis is. The second, more immediate reason to do it is that you are required. History Day projects with the new rules have made even more explicit that you have got to address the issue of significance in history, whatever your topic choice. You have to do it in two ways. Number one, you do have to have it in your process paper. It's a required element now in your process paper, so be sure to read over those rules. Secondly, and more importantly, let's say more dramatically for you, it is one of the criteria you're going to be judged on explicitly. So look at the new judging rubric as I have on the slide. Significance in history is a major component of what judges are going to be looking for and evaluating you on. And that means two things: significance in history, drawing an evidence-based conclusion about that topic's significance in history, and looking at both short-term and long-term impact. So just to restate in a little more detail, when you're addressing the significance in history of your topic, you're looking at either causes or effects, or you're looking at both. So you're looking at causes to understand what led up to that change or event and the significant role that event had in changing the way people lived, and understanding what led up to that. That's understanding the significance, how things came together to transform thinking or lifestyles or relations between countries. And then you're looking at effects. You're looking at consequences. You're looking at how things changed or did not change or partially changed as a result of those factors coming together. So causes and effects. And again, this enables you to draw parallels. So you can draw parallels between the past. If you understand causes and effects, draw parallels from the past to later periods in history or to the present day. You can make comparisons then. You can see similarities, you can see differences, and you can learn lessons, which is one of the main reasons we do history. What did they do that we don't want to do again, right? What led to something that was really very traumatic for people, and how do we avoid doing the same thing today? Or how did those people navigate a huge change in how they communicated, in their technology, in their thinking, because of new ways of thinking and new communication possibilities? How do they navigate that successfully, and how can we learn from that? So these are all reasons why to address significance, and this is what it means to address significance in history. You're looking at causes and effects. I think it's pretty clear, causes and effects. What I want to focus on now is the things to avoid. And this is coming from my experience as a teacher, grading essays for millions of essays over 30 years, but also judging lots of student projects. First and foremost, so caveats, things to avoid, pitfalls to avoid. Number one, do not be too narrow, simplistic in looking at significant effects. So you do need to look at both short and long term. That's right there in the rubric. You need to, don't just talk about an event happened and then things changed over the next 10 years. Well, they might have changed a lot more even over the 100 years. So if you're talking about significance, you can't just talk about a narrow window. You need to look at the broader long-term consequences. You need to look beyond just narrow range of people's lives, just economic or just social. If you're talking about something that transformed many aspects of their lives, you need to try and touch on, or at least acknowledge, the impact in a number of areas, even if you focus on one or two. But just talking about one that's just affected economics and ignoring social or political impact, when that was an important part of understanding that event, is an incomplete project, and it's an incomplete analysis. You also need to avoid simplistic opinions or conclusions. Nothing is all good, nothing is all bad in history. Great things can have some negative effects, especially for maybe some groups. Even terrible events can actually have some constructive consequences. My favorite example is the Black Plague, right, in the Middle Ages, which killed millions, but it actually ended the oppressive problems of overpopulation and meant a lot greater mobility for those who survived. So it had some socioeconomic benefits. Everything is nuanced, and the more nuanced your analysis of causes and or effects, the better. I put an example in my slide, for example, also of railroad. You look at the impact of railroads in North America, you have to not just talk about economic, but also social effects. People become more mobile. A lot of people were happy. It had a lot of beneficial effects. That the greater communication is devastating for Native Americans and very problematic for the environment. So there's nuanced consequences or effects of this significant change, like, let's say, the railroads. A second caveat, don't be too simplistic in talking about causes. Particularly avoid monocausal argument. This person did this and everything changed. I can't think of any instance in history where there's one person who changed everything. There's a number of factors that come together, often different groups, maybe even not at the same time, but previous. Again, the classic example is Martin Luther King did not change civil rights. He was a hugely important factor, but there was a lot of other people involved as well. Or Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks did this and then everything changed. There was people active before Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. There were people active and contributing at the time. There was a confluence of maybe political and social currents. Maybe the media at that time helped, right? The visibility they had was part of the factor, part of the confluence of factors. You cannot be monocausal and say this one event and then everything changed. You need to show a broader based understanding. Not saying you have to address everything. We know you're not writing a book. But you at least need to show your understanding that there's these deeper roots or these parallel events that contributed to what you are focused on in your discussion. You also need to remember that sometimes causes and effects are not directly related in the timeline. There can be, causes and the actual outcome doesn't really manifest itself for maybe 100 years. Things are not necessarily directly related in terms of chronology, so understanding that causes and effects can be separated by 50 years, by 100 years. This idea was mentioned, nobody listened to it, but then 100 years later, people started picking up on it. So these deeper roots of much later change. So be more, again, nuanced and sophisticated in your understanding of causes and effects. Try not to be too narrow, too simplistic, and monocausal. One of my favorite stories related to this is Wilberforce. He's a hero of mine. He was a member of parliament that worked for years, almost 2 decades, to have slavery deemed illegal in Britain. And he introduced legislation every year for 18 years. 18 years before it finally was passed. And over those 18 years, different things changed to finally get people willing to listen to him. He was persistent, but that change did not, you can't say William Wilberforce introduced it in Parliament and it happened, because you're missing 18 years of turmoil and causal events, and you're missing the lesson, which is that change is difficult and change is hard, and change takes a lot of efforts, a lot of different groups, and sometimes a long period of time. So be more sophisticated in your understanding and your explanation of causes and effects. Just have two more caveats to go. The other thing I feel very strongly about, because I see it often as a concern when I'm looking at student work, either in my classroom or in History Day projects, is you can't just assert a connection. You can't say, this happened, this person made a speech, and then there was legislation, right? And so this speech caused that legislation. Just because this happened and then later that happened doesn't mean there's a causal connection. You've got to prove that. So again, going back to kind of civil rights, a speech is made and a piece of legislation, civil rights takes place. You would have to prove that those legislators were influenced by that speech. So you'd have to look at their memoirs. You'd have to look at their speeches. Do they reference that thinker or maybe let's say Martin Luther King? Do they reference Martin Luther King as an inspiration? Do you look at their memoirs, look at letters to the editor at the time of what people are saying? You can look at other evidence I have on the slide, in some cases maybe facts or figures. So if you say this legislation took place and women started going to college in greater numbers, having access to literacy and scholarship. Well, just because the law was passed and you just say more women went to college, you've got to prove it to me. You've got to show me facts and figures, enrollments, more women getting degrees. You've got to have evidence to show this happened, then this happened. Whether you're arguing about the cause, whether you're focused on the effect, you've got to make the link. If you can't find that evidence yourself, and I know you've got limited, hours in the day and you're not, PhD students, find a good secondary source that argues that and asserts that connection. Quote as an historian who spent their career finding that evidence. Look at their research, look at their footnotes, quote them, and then that becomes your evidence that this led to this. Because this esteemed historian who has done the groundwork has asserted that this connection is there. But you've got to do the work. You've got to make the connection. You can't just assert, because of proximity of events, that there's actually a causal connection. Final point, and it's a pretty basic one, is be sure to structure your argument. Have an introduction and a conclusion. So many projects and students' papers come to me with a great introduction. Their thesis, they talk about significance, they've built up in the body of their work, maybe proving these points, and then it just ends. There's no summary conclusion, restating the significance, restating all of their key points. You've got to, whether it's a performance, whether it's a website, an introduction and a conclusion, and drive home the analysis that you've done. But don't leave a weak project by just having kind of your final panel on a website, which is your final argument that you've been making about this particular point, and then it just ends. And there's no conclusion. You undo all of the good work you've done in the rest of that project, and you've lost that the focus on that significance in history. Come back and hit me over the head with it in a good conclusion as the judge, as the reader. So finally, in summary, key points. Do not just tell the story of what happened. Talk about why or so what, causes and effects. Explore short as well as long-term causes and impacts. Avoid simplistic cause and effect arguments. Prove your conclusions with direct evidence. The more the better, the stronger your project. And structure your argument with a clear introduction and a summary conclusion. Have fun with this. History Day project gives you a chance to explore great stories, but also to learn from them. And in learning, it makes you better prepared to contribute to the world that you live in, where we can learn all the lessons about significant events, their causes and effects, and help to address the issues that we face today. So I look forward to seeing you at History Day fairs in the future.